Hi everyone, my name is Marcia, a final year student at Africa University studying international relations, and I'm taking you through a video assignment for the course Government and Politics and Global Perspective. I'm going to be talking about military coups in Africa. Their resurgence on the continent is intriguing to say the least. Is this a modern way of regime change approach or a sign of political decay? Stay tuned to find out. The resurgence of military coups in African politics recently is intriguing to say the least. It is a recurrent of militarism in the African continent, which nearly became an extinct phenomenon decades ago. However, its emerging and frequent nature has become problematic because military coups d'etats have the potency of creating a domino effect. They can spread wide and fast too, in the circumstance of the level of facilitation by the different situations. In 2021, Chad, Mali, Guinea, Sudan experienced mentioned coups have assumed backsliding Africa to the brink of a degenerate society which calls for relevant action. Not only has it displayed violence, it has questioned the meaning of independence within the African context and further made the notion of democracy rather flaky when it's associated with the continent. This video attempts to examine the resurgence of military coups d'etats in African politics in the light of being a modern regime change or political decay within the African context. Right. African states have experienced over 200 military takeovers in a period between 1960 and 2023. Many analysts believe that coups would be out of fashion by 2015 due to limited cases on the continent. However, at present, these coups are widely seen to be on the rise or dangerously back in fashion in Africa, as some countries such as Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Mali, Chad, Sudan, Burkina Faso have experienced a series of successful and failed military coups. Between 2019 and 2022, apart from the obstructed attempt to take over Guinea-Bissau current president Umaru Embalo on 1 February 2022, Burkina Faso's most successful coup was the one in which President Kabore was deposed by an army led by Lieutenant Colonel Damemba. West and Central Africa have translated into a state of coup d'etats at a rate that is never seen before, since before the adoption of the Lome Declaration in July 2000, which banned military coups and adopted sanctions against regimes that had taken power through a military coup. By definition, the Lome Declaration and the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance considers 4 situations as constituting instances of unconstitutional change of government, and these are military coup d'etat against a democratically elected government, intervention by mercenaries to replace a democratically elected government, replacement of democratically elected governments by armed dissident groups and rebel movements, and the refusal by an incumbent government to relinquish power to the winning political party after free, fair, and regular elections. Article 23, subsection 5 of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance as a 5th situation. Any amendment or revision of the Constitution or legal instruments which is an infringement on the principles of democratic change. To buttress the above, there have been military seizures of power in Chad, Guinea, Mali twice, Sudan, and in early 22, Burkina Faso since the end of 2020. This has not only raised an alarm, but underscored how West African states are the most burdened by military coups on the African continent. Furthermore, this has also raised several concerns on what the regional blocs are doing. This is particularly speaking to the Economic Community of the West African States, ECOWAS, with respect to the maintenance of peace and security in West Africa. Since antiquity, the military has always been an important institution of state protection. However, in continuously aiming to fulfill such a role, they have posed a threat to the governments that empower them due to the ability to use coercive force. Scholars such as North have argued that societies experiencing a civil war, by definition, do not have consolidated control of their military, it is highly necessary for militaries to use weapons, and the fear arises from the possibility of that army using those same weapons to counter the incumbent government. Rising social and economic stresses have eroded public confidence in institutions of democratic governance around the world, hence making it easier for militaries to fuel civil conflicts by using their coercive power and destabilizing political regimes. In many countries, this has galvanized populist or autocratic movements. All this could not come into being without the hand of the military institutions supporting civilian movements, like so in hopes to destabilize certain political regimes. Nonetheless, the question still remains whether the use of military coup d'etats in Africa is merely just a means of modern regime change or a sign of serious political decay. Military coup d'etat alludes to the sudden, forcible, and unconstitutional removal from power of an existing government by the military, usually with violence. One definition used is that of an illegal and overt attempt by the military or other civilian officials to unseat seating leaders. Coup attempts are defined as illegal and overt efforts by the military or other elites to remove the executive from power. Mostly, African politicians never had consensus on a good set of deeds of a legitimate government. This may seem the case, but in lower intensity in every single corner of the world. In Africa, however, not only the politicians have troubled themselves with politics and government, but the military leaders as well. Military coups are generally justified as to correct the course of a country that is expected to go through. Its credibility, however, is severely questioned, especially when you observe the effect on the ground. In Africa, even military coups were superseded by other military coups. Military coups are either carried out against a civil-led government or against the military themselves, regardless regime type, for example, monarchical, democratic, or authoritarian. Amongst the third world, Africa has to be the worst hit continent in the phenomenon of military coups. This shown by statistics which prove that there were 71 military coup d'etats in Africa in a period stemming from 1952 to 1990. And now, the figure is frightening and very alarming and rather unexpected of a supposed political institution whose legitimate functions for an armed force organization should be for defense and aggressive purposes only. The armed forces have assumed the role of an organization with an independent position on all major political issues, induced by the experience and armed force strengths of patriotism, discipline, professionalism, and cohesion domiciled at the heart of military service. On paper, the attributes of the military are tenable in the military of the West, as they account for minimal presence or absence in military interventions there. Conversely, the prevalence of military coups in Africa is exorbitantly high. The self-acclamation of patriots to the citizens when the time strikes is an accurate term in the case of Africa. For the greater part, military coups in Africa are largely staged with self-interest as the driving factor, proven by military budget enlargement, progressive change of ranks, and acquisition of sophisticated military equipment and technologies for their own organizational safety. During the coups, the military usually suspends the constitution, dissolves the old cabinet, and rules by decrees which have reflective effect. Most of its ministers are chosen from technocrats amongst the civilian populace that are highly professional and technical. This act of the military is blatant proof of the incapability to manage governmental affairs and statecraft, as technocrats are not the only facet necessary to propel any government into political and socio-economic success. One cannot critique the military without understanding the reasons that push it towards orchestrating coup d'etats. According to Luckham 2001, the several reasons given for coups in Africa include modernization, cultural pluralism, soldiers' greed and grievances, poor governance, corruption, autocracy, limited economic growth, and low income levels, amongst many other factors. Similarly, Morris in 2016 buttresses the above notion as he gives another reason for military coups being economic manipulation, which is used by dictators to suppress wages of armed force members, the foreshadowed downfall in the regime's ability to maintain both the military and civilian populace's allegiance, appeared during the worldwide economic crisis of the 1980s, where unemployment was seen to be rising among the general populace, and influential military leaders saw this as an opportunity to exploit the economic conditions to gain power. This, in effect, resulted in a series of failed coups from 1984 until 1991. To support the aforementioned, in Guinea, Conte was succeeded in a coup led by Captain Camara, where Teb bureaucrats endeavored to shake down bauxite producers. Guinea is the lead world producer of bauxite, and the shakedown significantly reduced the mining happening within the country. Conte was able to build a class of wealthy leaders consisting of military officers, and the wealth accumulated by some officers allowed them to build big businesses that were protected heavily by the military. Therefore, this relationship worked well for those in power, but physically and financially exploited those on the outside of military and business circles. And this, in effect, the action was largely used to impede the military's ability to stage a coup by reducing their economic influence. Additionally, the Ivory Coast mismanagement of the economy, coupled with the global economic crisis happening at the time, sowed major seeds of instability and disgruntled among the nation. In spite of their growing economic popularity, the bureaucratic elites and French foreigners seemed to be the only ones greatly benefiting, while the country continuously failed dismally to improve the lives of the ordinary citizens. Contrastingly, such actions have fueled a deeper desire within the military to seek aid and intervention from foreign entities, which forced them to retaliate stronger and stage more successful coups. As per the norm, in December 1999, Ivory Coast inevitably suffered its first coup, where military officers stood in solidarity and protested against unpaid salaries, poor working conditions, poor living conditions. This next section will focus on the resurgence of military coups in Africa. For a long time, until recently, the military was known to exist in the barracks only. However, their tamed body has been unleashed into the political atmosphere on the continent, resulting in an alarming resurgence rate of coups across the African continent. In September 2021, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres voiced concern over military coups are back and blamed a lack of unity amongst the international community in response to military interventions. Similarly, Judd Deverment from the US-based Center for Strategic and International Studies believes a more lenient approach by regional and international bodies has enabled coups to continue. Even though the military constitute an important part of the state, democracy requires that as an institution, the military is discouraged from interfering in civilian political affairs. But this is not the case in politics. The military intervention of Burkina Faso in January 2022, coupled with other coups in Guinea, Niger, Mali, continuously sparked debates on whether coups have resurfaced and how nationals are becoming forthcoming to such horrible events. Regarding Burkina Faso, the military assumed power of deposing Roch Marc Kabore's government in a time when the nation was at its peak of militant aggression. They managed to win the hearts of the citizens by promising peace, which unfortunately the people believed, but this has not been the case. Similarly, Mali's coups following 2012, 2020, and 2021 have experienced a ridiculous amount of military takeovers, asserting that indeed there is a problem regarding the political environment of the country and the continent. Different political mobilizations have been overtures to military interventions in Africa, just as they were in the past. Before the January 24 coup d'etat in Burkina Faso, different protests and mobilizations, violent or non-violent, had already arisen. Similarly, the other two arms of the above model have been evident in the recent coups. Africa should have learned from the past. These series of events are bound to reach their crescendo, which is expected to affect the community because of people's demands were not met. It is pertinent that other countries seeing the same symptoms should make immediate redress and rescue the situation because a coup is contagious. Military coup d'etats in Africa has become so popular because military intervention brings about a sense of legitimacy in another country and encouragement to other countries that may be in the same boat of political crises. Thus, if a military intervention has worked significantly for one country, neighboring countries begin to see it as a beacon of hope, a beacon of light. Similarly, since 2010, West Africa has experienced more than 15 military coups, and most shocking included that of Burkina Faso in 2022, which saw citizens welcoming and celebrating the military for intervening. This phenomenon has become so normalized in nations susceptible to terrorism, to violence, extremism, and a decay in the democratic process. There are internal dynamics which fuel coups apart from the population losing faith in the incumbent government. Although various discussions on the primary causes of military coups in Africa have focused on internal actors and factors, they have largely underestimated the pivotal role of foreign entities on the existence of military coups in Africa. The emergence of the US military forces in West Africa under the guise of counterterrorism denotes a new imperial influence, replacing that of the former French colonialism that has largely contributed to militarism and training of officers involved in these coups. An example includes France's post-Cold War approach, which tied French aid to human rights practices, meaning France would continue to assist its allies and refrain from interfering in internal conflict, and in effect, Francophone countries embarked on reforms to bring about a multi-party democracy, all in the guise of protecting their relationships with France, while the nations were characterized with the election rigging. Thus, France's intervention in Mali 2012, Mauritania, Niger, Burkina Faso, in efforts to fight off jihadist threats and civil unrest, meant involving the military to be the chaperones of peace and victory to the people, which effectively gave the military unconstitutional power to overthrow their political leaders and reoccupy the government. Moving on to the penultimate subheading of this video series, we finally delve into the question, are military coups a regime change or a sign of political decay? Political decay is a political theory originally described by a scholar named Samuel P. Huntington, which describes how chaos and disorder can arise from social modernization increasing more rapidly than political and institutional modernization. He speaks about the cognitive rigidity where a set of institutions is created under one set of circumstances. The circumstances change and there's no adaptation, but the other is what one would call insight capture, where human beings tend to want to reward their own friends and family. Africa is largely dominated by political institutions suffering from political decay, mainly because she inherited and imposed colonial administrative system that she could not manage. Instead of proposing African political institutions to African political institutions after independence, the recent resurgence of coups has resulted in reverse to the democratic consolidation process. The fall of Gaddafi's regime in Libya 2011 saw the emergence of Tuareg rebels and Boko Haram insurgencies in West Africa and the Sahel regions, respectively. The military, in effect, have emboldened the unconstitutional takeover of political power in areas where ethnicity is fragmented, such as South Sudan and Somalia, where exonerating the notions of a gun class, which can simply be defined as a military aristocratic group which has spearheaded the militarization of politics and entrenchment, therefore resulting in the decline of democracy. Political decay as militarism sets stages for coup d'etats. States susceptible to coups usually fail to uphold constitutions and hold democratic elections. Political decay occurs when military aristocrats stir up political disorder with the efforts to stifle democracy, which is usually met with resistance, as per the case in Ethiopia 2020, where political appropriateness, political will, and sovereignty were discarded. Additionally, the attenuation and effective design of judiciaries, legislatures, and electoral commissions to serve the executive body by a dominant military personnel have led to political decay, as there is no accountability within the political system anymore. Military coups in Africa have become a sign of a mere political decay because of their failure to provide for the constitutional right of human security. Human security refers to the freedom from the notion of physical threats and violence, whereas democracy or the modern regime change, supported by the Pan-African fathers, alluded to a political environment that supported human security and development. Coup d'etats are naturally violent in nature, as characterized by violent gun conflict and militia presence, which compromise the idea of human security to the citizens. The current sub-Saharan and West Africa is characterized by political instability depicted by broken law, a breakdown of order, as well as governance structures that spend heavily on defense structures, which derails their economies consequently. Contrastingly, the military coup d'etats in Africa have not always denoted political decay, but rather for a movement towards a true modern regime approach, which consists of attaining democracy in its best form. The reason behind the 2020 Guinea coup d'etat to former President Alpha Conde's modification of the constitution in 2020, which allowed him to run for a third term in office, and his authoritative rule in nature no longer emulated a free and just courts, thus resulting in an uprising. Similarly, former Malayan President Ibrahim Keita rigged the 2020 legislative elections, which undermined his personal legitimacy as corruption was on the rise in the country. This also resulted in his downfall. Therefore, the leaders lost popularity and were overthrown by unconstitutional means because citizens detested or democracy had given up on the ideology, but because they had departed from the pillars of democracy. This only proved that the reason civilians backed military intervention was for the sole purpose of it paving way for a more effective government, rather aspiring to live under the authoritarian rule that. Additionally, Sudanese protesters took to the streets in 2021 against the military power takeover, which had undermined the transition of power into the hands of the civilians after the ousting of former President Omar al-Bashir in 2019. In spite of the injuries caused and deaths experienced, the civilians still continued to demand their democratic rights. Therefore, the modern regime change approach, if ushered into any African government properly, can spearhead economic growth while significantly reducing corruption within the government. Authoritarian governments under military rule have failed dismally, hence why they continue a system that further plunges each country deeper into a political and socio-economic demise. And to the final segment of this video series, I am going to give you some recommendations that I and some colleagues have come up with to counter military coups in Africa. The first one being the management of social mobilization to have military coup resurgence. Social mobilization with smaller groups of people will not result in the resurgence of coups. However, when more politically relevant figures become involved, the government is forced to meet their demands, resulting in coups and interventions. Similarly, it can be noted that the youth in Africa spearhead and are the driving force behind mobilization, as their forms are characterized by their desire for rapid change, which the government is able to provide, then fuels their need to revolt. The second recommendation that we have is the dismembering of all current African political systems, structures, and the military, which are influenced by Western administrative systems, and remembering the modern African system of organs that can effectively curb the notions of military coups while ensuring transparency and upholding the constitutional rights of each and every citizen in Africa. The third being to reform financial support of the African Union's peacekeeping organ to rise and act as an individual continental body that can effectively combat all militias while presenting African solutions to African problems in order to restore peace and stability so that the countries can become more innovative, foster socio-economic growth, which caters to their rights.